Hello. As I start my timer, are you tired of me doing that yet? Are you tired of me saying hello in a really annoying way? Because I do that on purpose. I'm kidding. I'm half kidding. Welcome to the last, real lecture. The lecture where I'm actually doing original content. But the second last lecture if you're actually in the disability policy course. So, next week's lecture, I promise, is going to be 30 minutes, and it's all logistics. So I'll tell you about late right spaces, and I'll tell you about portfolio, and I'm also telling you about portfolio in this lecture, and how to submit, using OWL, and any other logistical questions that I get this week, and I decide that it's worth telling you in a face-to-face way, okay? So it's going to be 30 minutes of just, the course is over, what do I do to get a good mark? That's next week. This week, as the PowerPoint says, is Care Work Futurities, or Mutual Aid in Coronavirus, and I subtitled it Disability and Care Pathways, because that's ostensibly what I'm talking about. This is one of my favorite things to talk about, so I'm really happy to end the lecture series with this, and this is not really policy so much as it is policy adjacency or radicalizing you towards social justice activism, which in itself, I guess you could argue, is kind of a policy insofar as you can make personal policies to orient yourself more or less toward community or mutual aid initiatives. So there's an argument rhetorically for how this could be policy related, but I get that I'm kind of stretching it a bit. But, that said, I think most people talk about, particularly when they're talking about upper year courses, tangible takeaways, or what can I actually do with a lot of this content. And a lot of the policy content this term was very high policy and ideological and not something you can change in your home community, right? Like, you're not gonna fix ACA or C7 on a Sunday night in your house. But things like mutual aid or mobilization or modern care work are things that you could potentially do something about after this course ends and you no longer have to listen to me speak every week, which I'm sure you're excited about. And I guess that's my way of saying, I wanted you to have something tangible to take away on top of all the more high-flying ideological conversations we've had, because I know that while that's useful as a place to put knowledge or creating avenues for new research pathways for you, it's probably not useful in an immediate context. So this is supposed to be more immediately useful, or idea generating, or inspiring, which is a heavy and loaded word, but I'm using it in the best possible sense. Yeah, so I wasted 5 minutes rambling about that. Let's go. This is an image, I switched to the second slide, of your syllabus. This part, shockingly, is still correct. So week 12, that's where we are now, 28th of March. I'm recording this on the 29th of March. We're gonna do Adrienne's podcast article. That was actually a magazine article about the podcast, about the original recording, because it sums it up really nicely. So I gave you a summary of it instead. We're gonna do Alice Wong's Disabled Oracles blog post, because I think it's really good. And Dean Spade's lecture on mutual aid, which he is a genius of mutual aid, love using their work. And then I'll give you the instructions for the writing workshop. Every time we do a writing workshop, what comes next? The reader round! Yay! So next week you're ending the course with the final reader round, and that will be community-wide, or all play. okay? I'm not going to do the community callback seminar because I decided to make that your last write space. So I'm not going to give you the answer, but I will give you the instructions. So look forward to a write space next week. It's your last one. And then you've just got your exam, which is kind of stressful, but also kind of not because you're almost done. So that's really exciting. This is your time-checked agenda. I will do my best. I was getting better at that toward the end of the course, and now I'm not teaching this summer, so it was all for nothing. I'll do 10 minutes about your portfolio submission. That is your exam for this course. This is important. I will go over it again next week in your breakdown video, and I really, really, really want you to reach out and ask questions if you have questions, because I would really rather answer those questions and clarifications before everyone submits portfolios rather than after everyone submits portfolios. Okay? So 10 minutes on that, 2 minutes. I don't even think I have a slide for that, so that's going to happen right now. This is your mandatory reminder that you're allowed to grade me and my approach to pedagogy, if it behooves you. That's via uwo.feedback.ca. And apparently there's a whole login network set up, and you can click DS3311. That's our course code. And you answer what are presumably fairly opinion-based questions about me, my material, course relevancy, whether or not I like cats, etc. And I get to see it maybe after I've submitted course grades. So there is no way whatsoever anything you say on those surveys can impact how you do in this course. And just as a person that's striving to be empathic, I wouldn't want to penalize you for honest feedback anyway, and I genuinely solicit it. So even if you want to DM me on Discord before or after the course ends with, honest feedback about the course rollout, I am super interested in that, and I would love to hear that from you. Positive or negative. So even if your takeaway was, I learned basically nothing, but this was a good overview, that's helpful for me. Or, I thought this was helpful, and I learned X. That's helpful for me. It's all helpful. I would love to hear from you. So, tell UWO or their feedback network about this course, and then if you feel like it, you can tell me what you thought of this course. I'd be thrilled. So that's your 2-minute course evaluations. Done. We can check that off the agenda. 30 minutes on Care Futures, which is basically your readings breakdown. We did 3 readings, as described. 10 minutes on future directions in COVID caremongering. So I have broken this down for you as to, I'm not a famous mutual aid expert. What can I do in my community? I'll give you some ideas, because I'm good at that. Let's do it. And then the last 5 minutes, I'll give you the instructions for this week's writer's workshop. Nothing should come as a surprise to you in those instructions because we've already done it twice. And the only thing I've changed for workshop 3 is that instead of in your team, you do it as an entire classroom community. So we're opening it up to all play, is what I called it. So someone from any other team can edit your work, and you can look at work from any other team. And we will be doing that, I will show you, in the Workshop 3 channel. See, this channel is for activities will be done later. That later is now. The future is now. We're doing it in Workshop 3, okay? So, I will stop getting distracted. I'm very easily distracted today. You can tell I'm really stressed out. Exam, portfolio, submission. So the slide says, how does the exam final portfolio work? You have a fancy handout. It's really not that fancy. Posted in the announcements channel and on OWL materials. I will show you. You probably know this better than I do, but if you go to resources and you look at this network of bullshit here, the one that says exam portfolio submission instructions, click it, I think. Yep, and it downloads. Amazing. There it is. There are your instructions. Beautiful. Okay, so to flip back to the PowerPoint. So this document outlines the rationale, evaluation, and submission checklist. Okay, there are 3 components to that handout, and it is absolutely critical that you read that handout before you submit the exam, okay? And it's not written in academies, it's not written to try to confuse you. It is written as accessibly and clearly as I could physically manage to try to explain what I'm looking for, okay? So I wrote on the slide, let's go over it a little bit together. Let's do that. That's a good idea, past Sarah. Thank you, future Sarah. So I'm going to close this just so that it's not distracting as heck. That actually might be more distracting. There we go. Okay. So the top says you may play and modify. That's the same as the syllabus. So I'm aware that for some people, you know, organization looks a little different for them. This is my preferred organizational methodology, but if that doesn't work for you, if you want the submission to appear first, you just drag and drop this over here. You can put in line breaks if that helps you. I'm personally very distracted by line breaks, but you can totally do that. You can put in, you know, you can make the font bigger or smaller depending on what works for you, or if you have an e-reader, etc. That's what play and modify means. So as long as you don't change the actual text, you cannot change the directions. That is not within your power or purview. You can change anything else about how this document appears to work for you and your learning style, or your learning methodology, or whatever word we use for that isn't learning style anymore, because that means something different now, and it doesn't work. So I'm going to go back a little bit, because I was just doing that as a demonstration. There we go. So the rationale basically explains, hold on. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. The rationale basically explains why you're doing what you're doing, right? And I'm not going to read this for you word for word, because I'm aware you can read. But I am going to go over this part and this part to make sure we're on the same page, okay? So this is a cumulative assessment, which means all course instead of part course, that does 3 things, basically. It demonstrates your ability to execute the course objectives. There were 3 objectives for anyone who read the syllabus. Fun fact. It compiles your best work from across this semester instead of a time mastery element. Anybody who read, you know, any anti-ableism text knows how CDS Gang feels about timed mastery elements. They're kind of bullshit. They're ableist as hell. Obviously, I'm not doing that for our exam. So in lieu of that, you have kind of a structured performance exam that you can take as much crypt time as you want, as long as it's in by a certain day, so I can actually mark it, okay? And it allows editorial time and community feedback to greatly impact this performance grade in a positive way, because A, you'll always be able to ask for help in real life. I think it's just not realistic to put someone in a blank, confined room and say, you know, do your best, and if it's not good, sucks. That's not really like real life. But also, because your community, you know, in real life is really essential to the work that you're doing and being and living, right? So I wanted that to be reflected in the mark you receive for what was ostensibly a course about trying to teach you how to be productive in community, as an activist, as a policy analyst, as a student, as a future teacher, as a future healthcare specialist, etc. Those are the 3 goals. So I'm going to jump to the bottom here. It says, and I am reading verbatim, your portfolio is a structured exercise that is meant to show off how much you learned about your reflective process. So what did you actually think about after the lecture ended? Your broad policy knowledge. Did you learn anything from any of the lecture content? And your editing mastery. Did you improve any aspect of your writing skills from all the writing activities this semester? Okay? This is not meant to solve, big scare quotes, disability policy. It's impossible to give you a 12-week course that makes you an absolute master at every disability policy in the North American context, right? And that was not the point of this course. So this exercise is meant to show you how far you've come or how much you've learned in a 4-month period. And I wrote here, activism is ultimately a never-ending iterative process. My hope is that I have shown you ways and given you helpful tools and strategies to make sure you keep improving, reflecting critically, and working in writing communities, or activist communities, or policy communities, etc. after this class ends. We get better at things based on our ability to self-edit, self-reflect, and work in strong supportive communities. So that's why so much of the course theming was community-based and forcing you to work in teams and forcing you to interact with each other and forcing you to debate or reflect on things that you may have never encountered before. That's how we learn and live and write and be and do in an iterative process of learning and unlearning. And I'm sure I'm not the first person in your life to have told you that, but I am now the latest person in your life to have told you that because it is true. It is just a cultural truism. There is no counter story to it. That's just how it works, okay? I have been really impressed with the critical depth our classroom community accomplished through write spaces and discussions. So even though I haven't commented on all your write spaces, I do actually read them, and I really enjoy reading them. And sometimes I'm just overwhelmed by 50 write space submissions, and I don't know what to say every week, but I've made a project with myself that I'm gonna write back to you on a couple of them. But I've really enjoyed learning about your learning journey and what that pathway has looked like for you across this semester. And I know while entries dropped off in the last third of the semester, we lost about a little under half of you. I hope those of you who haven't been as participatory want to make an attempt at some of those entries, or want to give it a go, or want to find time to give it a go, because I really am interested in what your pathway looks like and what the kaleidoscope is coming together to look like for you. Because I'm the kaleidoscope at the front of the room right now, but by no means is my kaleidoscope the end-all and be-all of CDS gang or theory or policy, right? And I think so many of you have shared so many phenomenal and really profound lived experiences with me. And those lived experiences can be so transformative for you, for me, and for anybody you share that with in community. And that's kind of a lot of what this course was about, right? So I said for expectations, I'm not giving you a rubric because I truly cannot figure out a way to make them less ableist. And I'll let you know if I solve that problem. But in the meantime, I have 5 weighted points that basically guide what your submission should look like. So is there evidence of iterative improvement? Did you actually edit anything? Can I point to ways that my thinking, editing, or reflections have become more complex? Did I listen to the lectures and possibly research something? Do my final drafts honor the feedback of classroom community? When I participated in the workshop and the read-around, did I listen to what anyone else said to me? Does my exit interview seriously try to answer the questions? It's not hard, just answer them honestly. And do my peer review and community contribution elements demonstrate that you cared about creating positive community. And if that was a miss for you this semester, what can we learn from that moving forward, right? How would we not have gone back and changed it, but how would we have approached it differently had we had a redo of this course in the fall? How might those community skill building initiatives have helped in an alternate universe? So then the submission checklist, title page, 5 write spaces that have been edited, 2 workshop worksheets that you submitted to other people that you thought you did a good job on, and 1 exit interview. I'm giving you the exit interview sheet next week in the final lecture, okay? So all of those pages have to appear in a Word document that you submit. Wait for it. 2, assignments. You scroll to this mess, and this one says final portfolio. It is due April 13th at midnight. It's going to be really hard for me to give you an extension on this because I only have 5 days to mark 50 portfolios. Okay? So if you need an extension or you think this is absolutely not going to work for you, you need to pause this video and email me or DM me or do something to get in contact with me right now. Okay? Do not wait till April 10th to tell me April 13th isn't going to work. That's going to be really tough to figure out, okay? This is a hard deadline. This is the only hard deadline on this entire course. I really need them on the 13th, okay? And if you hand it in ahead of time, if you just finish it and you want to get this course over with, that's perfect. I have put the due date on pretty much the last possible day I can put it so that I can actually give you a grade for this course. Okay, I gave you the most time possible. So I hope that works for you. All the other drop boxes are here for those of you who haven't submitted yet, and I need to keep going. Let me check my time really quick. 22. Perfect. Okay, so the rest of this lecture, I just switched to a slide that says, wait, this presentation assumes that you have already read week 12 selections. So the Adrienne / Leia podcast, the Dean Spade article, and the Alice Wong article roundup. Excuse me. Pause here if that is not true for you right now. So I really want you to read them yourself first, and then I'll take them up with you. Okay, so I'm going to give you a second to pause if you need to pause. Welcome back. Okay, hello. So now that you've read our material for this week, I am thrilled to go over it a little bit with you. And I'm not going to go over it word for word because a lot of it is pretty self-explanatory. But I'm going to go over the parts that I thought were most salient for our classroom context, okay? And that's not the same as saying the most important parts. I didn't say that on purpose. I'm going over the parts that you might find most useful on your pathway right now, as I understand it. But I could be wrong, okay? So this is a slide. The title says, Masters of Modern Mutual Aid. That is my personal opinion. That is not a CDS gang opinion, though I feel like a lot of people would agree with my selection, so I haven't pulled these names out of nowhere, right? You'll get some argument as to who should or also be appearing, but there would be no argument that any of these names shouldn't be on this list, okay? And it's obviously a shorter list than some people could make. These are just my favorites. So we've got Dean Spade, American professor, and he leads the Big Door Brigade Mutual Aid Initiative. He wrote a book last year, orange cover, really loved it. It was literally called Mutual Aid. It was pretty much an instruction book on building fairly robust mutual aid community collectives with like real funding and opportunity for employment and stuff. Really great. Alice Wong, we've done her a lot this semester. She is, I think, also American. She is obviously the leader of the Disability Visibility OA project. She also wrote a book called Disability Visibility, obviously, in 2020, and that was a bunch of LXP, or lived experiences narratives, that were collected into an edited volume. Leah Lakshmi Piapsinya Samarasinha is on here. Again, you've heard all of these names this semester already. She's the lead artist for Sins Invalid, and she does about 50 other collectives. I'm sure I would not be able to name them all. Her latest book was a project with Egeris called Beyond Survival, but she also did care work. She also did Dreaming Disability Justice. You know, she's done a ton of work in mutual aid. And Adrienne Marie Brown, who is an American social worker, and her sister, Autumn Brown, run a podcast called How to Survive the End of the World. And a lot of it is about transformative justice, mutual aid, queer BIPOC, community collaboratives, and caremongering, etc. So if you like this kind of content, you would like her podcast, obviously. And if you're interested in social work theory or social work strategy, you would like Adrienne Marie Brown's works, such as Emergent Strategy. She also did one called Pleasure Activism, which was pretty cool. I don't know. I could go at length about any of these people. I just love them, right? Hi, Domino. Okay. So, as a positioning quote, I wish you would get out of the way, that I'm using to try to situate our conversation from these 4 oracles of mutual aid, I chose a quote from Leah from Adrienne and Autumn's podcast. And she says, I would often describe TJ, or transformative justice, as anything that creates more safety, justice, or healing for people who have survived violence, abuse, or harm that doesn't rely on cops or courts. So basically, that doesn't rely on our current systems of injustice. Right? And I'll let you sit with that quote, because there's really nothing I can say to expand on it that she hasn't already inferred here. It's just a really clever positionality on how transformative justice manifests in real life, right? So we'll sit with that for a second. Just think about it. Love it. Okay. So I'm going to start with Dean Spade's mutual aid chart take-up, and I kept all the articles up just so I could give you a quick visual. This is something he developed. I think it actually appears in the mutual aid book. I wish I was unpacked so that I could show you the book, or any of the books I've mentioned, because I have them, but they're all in massive boxes. So I'm sorry, but this is pretty much verbatim from mutual aid. And what he did was created a chart that tried to map in the least reductive way possible, considering it's a binary chart, of what he calls horizontalism versus hierarchy, or hierarchalism. So if you think of a business, and we can call the business Disability Inc., right? There are 2 ways we can construct how the business operates. If I'm talking horizontalism, I'm giving as many people in Disability Inc. as possible as much equalized power as I can. So it would be kind of radical democracy, right? Where everyone at the table has an investor vote, and everybody's trying to work on all the same goals, right? That is in stark contrast to hierarchalism, which is what we're more used to in a neoliberalist society, where we assign people roles and power inherent to those roles. So instead of going horizontal, I've gone vertical, right? So you start with the president, and then the president's vice presidents, and then the vice president's assistants, and then a board of people with voting power, and then a number of employees with no voting power, but they work at Disability Inc. So you still have horizontals in that structure. All the voting board members would be horizontal, but the structure itself is vertical. Okay? So I hope you understand the difference there. And if you want to know more about that, there's another book that's not in this lecture, but it was called Healing Resistance. Really transformative book by Kazu Haga. He talks a lot about this structure as a core component of true mutual aid work. Okay? So if you want to know more, check out that book. He's also got like a ton of interviews online. So a couple key notes from the mutual aid chart, and these are presented as binaries. So obviously there are exceptions, and we are being reductionist, but as a general rule, I guess I would say, we've got survivalism versus proto-capitalism. So horizontal structures tend to favor absolute survival mechanisms. So instead of the best case scenario, we want what is best for the most people possible in a survivalist mechanic, okay? And that is contrary to the proto-capitalist model, which would say, I want good results, but if I can get 90% of people an A result and 10% of people have to take a D, that is the best solution for us. That would not work in a survivalist system, right? Because you've left 10% of people behind. So maybe a good way of summarizing that would be, survivalism leaves absolutely no one behind, or as few people as is physically possible, whereas proto-capitalism will favor an abject majority, and if it's a non-noteworthy number of people left out, that's collateral damage. That's okay. Okay? So the next bullet point, I am not feeling well. Expectation less versus trade agreement. So for all the people at Disability Inc., if I'm going back to the horizontal that I'm making with my hands here, expectation less means that you're doing it for nothing in return. You're not expecting anything. You don't feel deserving of anything as a result of what you've done, right? So that's in, or not in abeyance to a trade agreement method, which is something like unions or union dues. And I'm not saying I'm anti-union, but, if you pay into this system, you're expecting a result. You feel deserving of something. If you buy into some kind of membership system, you get benefits or rewards from that system. And that speaks to a deservingness culture cultivated by capitalism, where if I do X, I therefore deserve Y as a primary component of how we live and operate. In a true mutual aid horizontal framework, you are just giving that aid, and there is no deservingness paradigm working there. So I am doing, a luncheon for 100 people, and no one pays, there is no membership, there are no dues, none of the staff are expecting payment, they're just doing it. Okay? So then I put consensus direct aid versus top-down aid adjacency and non-politicalization. This is getting really complicated really fast. Okay, so if I were to try to explain that in 10 seconds, in a horizontal mutual aid methodology, The consensus direct aid is something that everyone in Disability Inc. agrees is important to mobilize for. And because they're not operating from that deservingness reward structure, they don't need to worry about the top-down implications of supporting X, or what are the implications politically if I help this abortion clinic, or which board members can or cannot participate in this initiative. If you do top-down aid adjacency, there's a lot of politics around what you can and cannot participate in, or donate money toward, or donate resources toward. That consensus direct giving aid just does not worry about. They're like the no fucks given collective that's gonna show up to the abortion clinic with the manpower to try to make it a safe corridor for women and women identifying people to use their services, as an example, right? So that depends on the belief that I put in brackets that mutual aid is de facto political. So if you're actualizing a true version of horizontal mutual aid, you have committed politically to that vision. And I don't think you can do that work without making a kind of political commitment, is what I'm saying there, because it makes decisions for you about what your time is worth, what you deserve, what you donate to or what you choose not to donate to, etc. There's a lot of self-work involved in consensus direct aid that assumes your positionality in ways that a hierarchical structure don't assume on your behalf. Okay? And if you want to talk more about that, I definitely can. I'm trying to summarize this really quickly, but I recognize now in trying to explain it, I'm over-summarizing a little bit. And the last one says interdisciplinary versus single-issue cause work. And all that means is that, horizontalist aid sees that no cause can exist in a vacuum. So if you're anti-ableist, you are highly likely also pro-feminist and anti-racist and etc. Versus single-issue causes like, for example, Greenpeace, where all you care about is the environmentalist stake, and none of the other adjacent causes are causes within your purview. So you would refuse aid if it wasn't about X sub-issue of environmentalism. Okay, and there's a lot of problems with that, but that's a quick summary. So I said at the bottom, choose to be involved with efforts, initiatives, and organizations that are closer to Dean's imaginary of mutual aid construction, or the horizontal Disability Inc. structure, at a policy level. Most of what I'm talking about here are company or organizational policies that you'll want to be aware of when you're making commitments to people, right? No organization is perfect, but some organizations try harder than others to mask this kind of horizontalism versus bureaucratic verticalism. So you want to try to stay away from the more bureaucratic initiatives, because chances are, and I'm being really careful saying this, chances are they're taking some liberties when it comes to true or well-facilitated mutual aid. Okay? Okay. Awesome. So I'm going to move on. Alice Wong's Disabled Oracles article, and I'm going to check the time really quick. Okay, 40. So I'm going to move kind of quickly through this. I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what to look for, really. The slide has a quote from the blog post that I gave you that Alice wrote last year, and it says, "Disabled people know what it means to be vulnerable and interdependent. We are modern-day oracles. It's time people listen to us." And she's not pulling this out of nowhere, right? Like, CDS Gang has been saying this kind of thing for years and years and years, that, you know, crypt technoscience and disability meaning making and the ways that interdependence and community care is created is best envisioned by collectives like the disability community, where that has been required for survival, right? So kind of the whole point of the book Beyond Survival was from the thesis that if disabled people have kind of invented and reinvented what survival care means and existed outside of these systems of injustice that kill them or frequently leave them out, what would it then mean to go, here's the title, beyond survival, into a full community dynamic that includes more abled people and includes living more joyful, more alluring lives beyond the mechanisms of surviving day to day. Okay, so that's there's a lot in that quote, right? But it's a really good quote. I'm going to switch my tab to the article itself. She gives a little bit of her background and lived experience, which I shouldn't speak for. You can read it for her. And then she gives you a couple articles and overviews of basically what we've been talking about all course, about how coronavirus picks and chooses people worthy of saving. And by and large, the conversation within the MAD or CDS community has been, if you meet X pre-existing conditions, which is essentially any condition that is disabling, you were not worthy of saving in coronavirus. And we've spoken about that at length, right? There are so many ways that that is just true, including, and probably most importantly, in the eugenics lecture. Right? So she quotes herself, speaking from Vox, "Were I to contract coronavirus, I imagine a doctor might read my chart, look at me, and think I'm a waste of their efforts and precious resources." And we spoke about that in the eugenics lecture. We spoke about that in Shane's Canadian healthcare lecture. We spoke about that with advanced madness and how schizophrenia is the second most valuable predictor of dying from COVID after age. That's just unexplainable, right? Beyond modern eugenics and picking and choosing who gets to live, right? There's really no other way around it. So we come up with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these examples over the past 2 years, but we're still seeing policy making that uses triage policy. And that triage policy is not, maybe Leah would say moving beyond survival, right? It's creating survivalist conditions. So from the New York Times opinion, quote, "For clinicians to take my vent away from me would be an assault on my personhood and lead to my death," Alice Long told A. Neiman, who is assumably a reporter for the New York Times. "I deserve the same treatment as any patient." So, ostensibly a right to life argument. And she gives you, just dozens of examples here, right? And she's pulling on other people who give examples of being selected to not participate in American or Canadian healthcare, or she's done threads about how this has affected the higher education community. She's done threads on how it affects long-term care homes. It's all here, and you can explore it yourself over and over and over again, right? So that's what I wanted you to see. Quick collection. The whole project blog is basically quick collections of these stories, if that interests you. But I have to move on, okay? So that's Alice Long's blog in a nutshell. Now we're going to do Adrienne and Autumn and Leah and Ajaris's episode of How to Survive at the End of the World. So again, this is Adrienne and Autumn's podcast, who are both American social workers, who are really, really interested in BIPOC mutual aid and queer femme care work and American healthcare policy. And they have a bunch of disabled activists or queer activists or BIPOC activists on their podcast, and they essentially talk about moving beyond survivalism, which is where the name of the podcast comes from, right? So one week last year, I was super, super thrilled that Adrienne had Leah on. Leah Anajaris, who just wrote the book Beyond Survival. And that's the podcast episode summary that I gave you, because these 4 people in a room together is like, oh, that's awesome. This is great content making. And it was great content. So these are 4 like superstars of mutual aid and care work, all sitting in a room, or I guess separate rooms in 2021, having a conversation about aid and its relationship to transformative justice. And I've pulled a couple quotes for you here. The whole interview is great. Even the summary of the interview is great. Please read the whole thing, okay? So Anajaris says, I think of TJ as a framework that includes strategies on how we prevent and intervene and hold people accountable and heal from violence and harm. And that's a really structural, justice-based strategy that proponents like Dean Spade and Kazu Haga would really like. And that doesn't speak for everyone in DJ or TJ, but it does speak to people who are more interested in how that works at a very literal structural level of how we might roll that out. Okay? So then Leah, who is a little more post-structuralist, shall we say, says emphasizing transforming perpetrators. So the policy making that leads to that is what she's implying here. That's not wrong, but sometimes people feel like, but they didn't transform. So I guess we failed, which is kind of, one of the core problems at looking at mutual aid from a purely structural perspective. But the survivors are alive. The survivor got out of the relationship. The survivor was able to set up, deviant structures where they were able to live and work and be free and heal. And those are wins. So she's talking about a more post-structural strategy, and I would say that I'm a proponent of more this style as my bias, of looking at things beyond the structure toward the individual, like a universal design framework, where we're looking at how that top-down might have failed, but also the ways in which we can create little big wins from those failures, or look at the ways that survival was still transformative, even if survival wasn't the goal directly. Okay? So that's more of a social work take on the structural problem of justice. And then Anajaris, later in the interview, says it's pretty impossible to commit to TJ without also committing to the relationship building work and the small and big parts of practicing transformation. So she's making headway toward what Adrienne eventually says outright, which is transformative justice really is about community. So none of it can be done without relationship building, without community building, without charisma building, without the ability to speak to issues that are critically important to you. It can't happen in just a policy or just one person. It has to happen in this banded mutual aid framework or collective of people who are all interested in the same goal. That's kind of where the interview ends up. All these different ways of saying community is the answer to this. How do we get more people in on the idea that community is the answer to this? Okay? And there are tons of books about that, and we've spoken about that. So future directions in caremongering. I'm going to bring this back down to our level, and I wrote, bless you, bless you. Oh my goodness. I don't know if you heard that. Domino just sneezed like 4 times. Okay, so it says, so I'm not a globally known activist. What caremongering can I do in my own community collectives? So I know that you're not going to go out here and write 5 books about mutual aid like Leia, or you're not going to open a transformational movement like Dean Spade this summer, right? That's not a good stepping stone, but I want you to be thinking about the pathway you're walking now and the things you can be doing on that pathway on the way to a pathway that looks more like Leia's or Jairus's or Dean's or Alice's or Hannah's or Danielle's or any of these people in CDS Gang or DJ or TJ or Madness. Any of these collectives I've spoken about this semester, they all started somewhere, right? So where could I suggest that you start this summer or this fall? And I love talking about this at conferences and at activist collectives because I think the idea generation of where or what can I do today is really valuable and transformative and profound, because that empowerment enables you to envision that care work future, right? So I wrote here, reimagine contextual caremongering. What am I personally strong at? What do I have to offer with the power that I have available to me on my current pathway? So I took this course contract as a no power, no big deal doctoral candidate at another school, and I leveraged what little power I was given this semester to really radicalize what a disability policy course could be and mean and do. That's kind of what I'm talking about here. So I used what I'm strong at, which is reading and reiterating policy and theory, to try to mobilize activism in the micro context of one Western course. I have this much power in this space with 25 people, and I have 12 weeks to try to get them to care about disability justice, or transformative justice, or microactivism, or mutual aid caremongering. How can I use the power at my disposal here to make people want to think about that outside of contexts where I'm holding the power? So if you walked away from a lecture and you spoke about something you learned to someone else, or you looked something up or wanted to learn more about something, that's power being enacted outside of space, right? And that's kind of the goal of a lot of activism that people in CDS Gang or Mad Gang or etc. try to do. We don't want to radicalize you in the sense that all you think and talk about and do ever is now disability work, but we're just trying to plant the idea that there's more to the conversation, there's more to the policy, there's more I personally could be doing to be a positive community member for these efforts and initiatives and causes, etc. And if we accomplish that in any, context through this course, that's caremongering at a micro level, right? So I'll give you some other examples from the power you might hold as a student or a community leader or the leader of a club or a member of a club that has power, or someone who has the institutional power of being a university member, etc. I put making space, so holding grief space, holding comfort space, holding bitch space, all of these ways that we're creating space for others to be their truest selves, asking how are you really instead of how are you, or asking, radical honesty vibe check. Ways that you can solicit truer or more true responses from your allies and community members and friends. You can teach, like I do. I get paid to just go to schools and talk about disability, and in a way, it's activist, because if I can make one person in the room give a shit about disability or disability activism, that's one more person than we had yesterday, right? You can mobilize your club, your Girl Guides, your collective. You can mobilize people in other classrooms. You can mobilize family members or friends that don't, do the same program you do. You can volunteer for people like Fireweed Collective, for people like Disability Justice Network of Ontario. You can volunteer for, oh my gosh, the Mad COVID group. You can volunteer for, you can host readings, you can host activity nights, you can host book clubs, etc. Educating friends and peers. A lot of that we already kind of said. You can make food for people. That's a really micro way of enacting mutual aid, right? If they're in a really dark place and they haven't been cooking for themselves and they haven't been taking care of themselves, you can make a warm meal or a soup and bring it to them. When I was living in my Ninja Turtle sewage situation in February, I had my community allies. They brought over tons of food for me because they knew I couldn't cook. And that really, really helped me, and they just knew to do that because they put together, what can't Sarah do right now? She doesn't have water, and she doesn't have most electric capabilities. So something tangible and activist they could do was bring over food that they made. That was really wonderful and touching. Making art. If you're an artist or you're creative, you can make art for people. You can play music. Same idea. Your ability to decompress and self-care creates the battery life to make yourself available for mutual aid. So there's a lot of people who will say, self-care is radical aid, right? Because your ability to charge your battery creates the long-term availability of communities of people who can help, right? Modeling activism, voting, obviously, holding and facilitating space, which is kind of the same as making space. Facilitating space means you're teaching others to do it, or you're holding spaces that are primarily educational in nature. Making care packages for people, sending letters. You can handwrite letters just to tell people you're thinking about them. And you can ask them, how are you? Really? Phoning your allies to, don't stop at texting. Maybe they actually need to hear a real human voice. Creating safety teams. Fireweed Collective does great talks on that. I have a talk about that. Taking educational courses, so going beyond this lecture into more disability material or more mutual aid work material. Leveling up your capacity to be teaching others this material. Joining activist collectives, radical love, so being able to say to your friends, I want to remind you that you're loved, and that I love you, and that so-and-so loves you. And I just thought you should know. That does radical work. Showing up for others. Mia Birdsong wrote a great book about that. It was literally called How We Show Up. And it has tons of material like this about how to show up for community collectives. It's wonderful. I plug that book constantly, okay? This is a non-exhaustive list. We could have done 30 slides on how to show up for others. But this should get you started, okay? So with my last couple minutes, I'm going to go over writing workshop 3. I have 1 minute, so it's all play, which means that everyone in community is fair game, not just your team. post your right space in workshop 3 for anyone to edit. And you have to also pick a document to edit. So it is a trade, okay? It is due Sunday at midnight, no matter what OWL says. I will never master OWL, so ignore it. It's always due Sunday at midnight, okay? Please be kind. Use the workshop worksheets. It's exactly the same thing we've been doing all term. They will be kind back to you. Trust your community to help you in, wait for it, mutual aid frameworks, okay? Read around 3 is next week, so the right space you pick this week is the one you're reading. So think about one that you're okay to share with community and that you'd like to share and edit and create with community. Because we will be reading it in our final week lecture. And you are also posting that for the whole community, not just your team. Because I think the cheerleading from the whole class perspective is really important at the end of a community course, right? So this last slide, mostly for community, but also a good reminder for you guys. Thank you. You can follow up with me on Twitter. You can follow up with me via email. You can follow up with me on Discord, obviously. The contact information for me is right there. And I really, really hope to see you next week. I love you. Keep going.